The first hard frost of the Montana Territory autumn arrived not with a whisper, but with the brutal, cracking silence of a landscape seizing up under sudden cold. It was late September, 1883, and Sarah Miller stood in the center of her meager surface garden, her boots crunching on soil that had turned to iron overnight. The kale was wilted, black-edged and ruined, and the few remaining pumpkin vines lay like tangled, frozen snakes across the ground. At 28, Sarah knew exactly what this meant. With James gone, buried now for 6 months on the hill overlooking the cabin, the margin for error had vanished. There was no reserve of cash to buy flour from the mercantile in town, and the salted pork in the larder would not stretch until spring. She looked at the blackened leaves and felt a rising panic, a cold tightness in her chest that mirrored the temperature of the air. Her breath plumed before her, white and ragged. Beside her, 10-year-old Thomas kicked at a frozen clod of dirt, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized coat, a garment that had once belonged to his father. "It's all dead, isn't it, Ma?" Thomas asked, his voice flat, devoid of the whining tone one might expect from a child. He had grown up fast since the accident at the mill. "The surface crops are gone, yes?" Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She knelt, her knees aching against the hard ground, and dug her fingers into the soil. It was frozen solid for the first 2 inches, but beneath that, the earth was still crumbling and soft. She paused, her hand resting in the dirt, feeling the faint, residual warmth trapped beneath the frost line. She looked toward the root cellar James had dug 2 years ago. It was shallow, prone to flooding, and barely kept the turnips from rotting, but it gave her an idea. She remembered the stories her grandfather had told of the old country, and the sunken gardens some of the miners spoke of, pits where the earth's own heat battled back the winter. "We aren't going to accept this," Sarah said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her skirt. She looked at the barren patch of land south of the cabin, a slope that caught the sun from dawn until the early afternoon. It was rocky, dismissed by the neighbors as useless for plow farming, but it had the right angle. "We're going to plant again, but not here." "Plant?" Thomas looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Snow's coming, Ma. Mr. Henderson says it'll be a 3-foot winter." "Let Mr. Henderson worry about his own fields," Sarah said, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the slope. "We're going down, Thomas. We're going to dig. Go get the pickaxe and the heavy shovel. And fetch Emily. We have work to do before the ground freezes any deeper." The decision to dig was not made lightly. It was a gamble of calories against time. To move earth required energy, food they could barely spare, but to do nothing was to accept starvation. Sarah marked out a rectangle on the south-facing slope, 12 feet long and 8 feet wide. It was an immense volume of earth to move by hand, but the location was specific. By digging into the hill, they could use the earth as a blanket. She took the first swing of the pickaxe, the metal ringing out against a hidden stone, sending a shockwave up her arms and into her shoulders. It was a jarring, violent start to a project that would consume their lives for the next month. For the first 3 days, the work was slow and agonizing. The topsoil was thin, giving way quickly to a layer of dense, clay-heavy subsoil packed with river stones. Sarah worked the pick, breaking the ground, while Thomas and 8-year-old Emily worked with shovels, clearing the loose debris into a wheelbarrow. They established a rhythm, a silent dance of labor that began as soon as the sun crested the mountains and did not stop until the light failed them. Sarah watched her children, their faces smeared with dirt, their breath huffing in the cold air. They did not complain. Emily, small for her age but fierce, dragged rocks half her weight to the perimeter, building a pile that Sarah intended to use later. By the end of the week, they were waist-deep in the trench. The deeper they went, the more the temperature stabilized. While the wind howled across the surface, cutting through wool and canvas, down in the pit, the air was still. Sarah paused to wipe sweat from her forehead, despite the freezing air above. She measured the depth constantly. They needed to be 6 feet down on the north side, sloping up to 3 feet on the south. This angle was critical. It would allow the low winter sun to penetrate the entire space while the earth walls insulated the crops. "Why are we digging a grave, Ma?" Emily asked one afternoon, leaning on her shovel, her chest heaving. "It's not a grave, Em," Sarah said, handing the girl a canteen of water. "It's a lung. The earth breathes warm air if you go deep enough. We're going to trap that breath." She took the shovel from her daughter's hands to give her a break, driving it into the clay. "The frost kills because it touches the air. Down here, the ground stays 50 degrees, winter or summer. If we can keep the snow off and let the sun in, we can grow potatoes while the snow is drifting over our heads." The physical toll was immense. Sarah's hands were blistered, the skin raw and peeling, wrapped in strips of rag at night. Her back throbbed with a dull, constant ache that made sleeping difficult. Yet, as the pit deepened, a sense of security began to grow. They were creating a fortress against the winter. The deeper they dug, the more they committed themselves to this strange subterranean logic. They were removing tons of earth, bucket by bucket, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, sculpting a void that would soon be their only hope for survival. As the excavation reached its final depth, the community began to take notice, and not kindly. The Miller homestead was visible from the main road leading into town, and the sight of a widow and her 2 young children disappearing into a hole in the ground drew stares and whispers. Mr. Henderson, their nearest neighbor and a man who prided himself on traditional farming methods, stopped his wagon one afternoon. He was a large man, red-faced from the wind and whiskey, and he looked down into the pit with a mixture of pity and disdain. "Sarah," he called out, his voice booming over the sound of the wind. "You digging a cellar? Seems a bit large for the few sacks of turnips you got left." Sarah straightened up, leaning on her pickaxe. She was 6 feet below him, looking up at his silhouette against the gray sky. "Not a cellar, Mr. Henderson. A garden." Henderson laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "A garden? In October? You've gone addled with grief, woman. The ground's freezing. You're wasting your strength and working those children to the bone for nothing. You'd be better off selling the land and taking the stagecoach east. This country isn't for experiments." "The land isn't for sale," Sarah said, her voice projecting clearly from the earth. "And my children are eating. Can you say the same for your herd if the blizzards come early?" Henderson scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't say I didn't warn you when the drifts fill that hole and bury you with it." He snapped his reins and the wagon lurched away. Sarah watched him go, her jaw set. She turned to Thomas, who was looking at the retreating wagon with worry in his eyes. "Ignore him," she said sharply. "He looks at the sky and sees only what has happened before. We are looking at the ground and seeing what could happen." They turned their attention to the walls. The earth was stable, but it needed reinforcement to prevent collapse during the thaw. Sarah used the pile of river stones Emily had collected to build a retaining wall along the north face, the deepest part of the pit. This stone wall served 2 purposes. It held back the earth, and it acted as a thermal battery. During the day, the sun would strike the stones, heating them up. At night, that heat would slowly radiate back into the pit. Sarah mixed a mortar of clay, sand, and straw, teaching Thomas how to pack it between the stones. "Tight joints, Thomas," she instructed, guiding his hands. "No gaps. If the air can get through, the frost can get through. We need this wall solid." They worked methodically, stacking stone upon stone. The labor was heavy, but the stone wall rose steadily, a gray shield against the northern cold. On the earthen sides, they used rough-sawn planks salvaged from an old collapse at the edge of their property, shoring up the soil to prevent it from crumbling inward. With the pit dug and the walls reinforced, the most technically difficult phase began: the roof. This structure, the covering, was the heart of the innovation. It had to be transparent enough to let in sunlight but strong enough to bear the weight of heavy snow, and sealed tight enough to trap the heat. Sarah had been planning. For months, she had been scavenging, collecting heavy canvas and treating it with layers of linseed oil until it was translucent and waterproof. "Careful with this," Sarah warned, as she and Thomas unfolded the thick, heavy canvas. If this tears, we have no garden. They constructed a frame from lodgepole pine poles they had cut and stripped earlier in the season. The angle was crucial. Sarah set the roof pitch at a steep 45 degrees sloping toward the south. This angle would shed snow effectively, preventing the weight from crushing the covering, while presenting the surface directly to the low arc of the winter sun. They stretched the heavy canvas, which Sarah had treated with layers of linseed oil until it was translucent and waterproof, over the frame. It was a vast, heavy sheet, and they worked carefully, securing it with nails Sarah had straightened from old lumber and strips of leather. The canvas pulled taut, a pale, milky film across the opening. "It looks like a giant tent," Emily observed, standing back to look at the strange, slanted roof rising barely 2 feet above the ground level on the north side, flush with the ground on the south. "It's a heat trap," Sarah corrected, running her hand along the seam where the wood met the earth. She mixed a slurry of mud and straw, packing it around the perimeter of the frame to create an airtight seal. The sun goes in, turns to heat, and can't get out. The earth holds it. They spent 2 days just sealing the structure, hunting for the tiniest draft. Sarah used a candle, moving it slowly along the joints inside. If the flame flickered, they added more clay. By the time they were finished, the structure looked less like a building and more like a strange, milky scar on the hillside, hunkered down against the coming assault. The interior of the pit was now a different world. Descending the crude earthen steps into the finished structure felt less like entering a cellar and more like stepping into a suspended breath. The air inside the pit was heavy, still, and smelled intensely of damp loam and the linseed oil curing on the canvas overhead. While the wind bit at the exposed skin on the surface, down here 6 feet below the frost line, the atmosphere was stable and strangely quiet. Sarah stood at the bottom of the stairs, her hand resting on the stone retaining wall she and the children had labored over for weeks. The stones were cool to the touch, but not freezing. They held the faint, residual warmth of the deep earth, a constant 50 degrees that felt balmy compared to the 30-degree chill outside. The light filtering through the oiled canvas was diffuse and golden, casting long, soft shadows across the floor of the pit. It was a cathedral of dirt and scavenged wood, a pocket of resistance against the coming winter. "It feels like a cave, Ma," Emily whispered. Her voice hushed as if speaking too loudly might rip the canvas roof. She ran her hand along the rough-hewn timber bracing the south wall. "It's a lung, remember?" Sarah corrected gently, moving to the center of the space where they had prepared the planting beds. "And now we have to make it breathe." The floor of the pit was not merely the bottom of the hole. They had dug trenches within the floor, filling them with a mixture of the loose topsoil they had saved, aged manure from the mule stall and straw. This composition was deliberate. As the manure and straw decomposed, they would generate their own heat, a slow chemical burn that would supplement the geothermal warmth of the walls and the solar gain from the roof. It was a delicate balance of biology and physics. Sarah knelt by the first bed, opening the burlap sack that contained their most precious resource, the seed potatoes. These were not the shriveled leftovers from the root cellar. These were the best of the previous year's crop, saved specifically for a gamble Sarah had never taken before. Cutting the potatoes into sections, ensuring each piece had at least 2 eyes, was a task that required surgical precision. If she cut too close, the eye would rot. If she wasted the flesh, the sprout wouldn't have enough energy to start. Thomas watched her knife work, his face serious. "If these die," he said, voicing the fear that hung in the humid air, "we don't have anything for planting come spring." "They won't die," Sarah said, though her stomach tightened at the truth of his words. They were burying their future food supply in a hole in the ground while the neighbors were battening down hatches. She handed Thomas a section of potato. "Plant it deep, for inches. We need the roots to find the heat in the decomposing straw." They worked in a line, the 3 of them, pressing the tubers into the dark, rich mix. It was an act of supreme faith. Above them, through the distortion of the old canvas, the sky was turning a bruised purple, signaling the first true storm of the season. But down here, with their hands in the dirt, it felt like a secret spring. They watered the rows sparingly with water hauled from the creek, the moisture darkening the soil, and then covered the beds with a loose layer of dry straw to hold the humidity. When they finally climbed out, sealing the heavy wooden trapdoor behind them, the contrast was violent. The wind hit them like a physical blow, instantly freezing the sweat on their backs, a stark reminder of the hostile world they were trying to outwit. November brought the first true test of the system, arriving in the form of a 3-day blizzard that buried the valley under 4 feet of drifting snow. The cabin groaned under the wind, the timbers creaking like a ship at sea, and for 72 hours, the Miller family was confined to the single room of their home, feeding the stove stick by stick. Sarah slept fitfully, her dreams filled with the sound of tearing canvas. She imagined the weight of the snow crushing the canvas roof, the cold rushing in to kill the fragile life they had planted. When the wind finally died down on the 4th morning, the silence that followed was deafening. The world was a blinding white expanse, the landmarks erased, the fences buried. "The garden," Thomas said immediately, pulling on his boots. "We have to check the covering." They waded through waist-deep drifts to reach the site of the pit. From the surface, it looked like nothing more than a hummock in the snow, a smooth white mound indistinguishable from the rest of the landscape. Panic flared in Sarah's chest. If the snow blocked the light for too long, the heat inside would fail. Or worse, the weight had already collapsed the frame. "Shovels," she ordered, her voice sharp. "Careful. Don't strike down. Slide the snow off." They worked frantically, clearing the perimeter first. As Sarah carefully pushed the blade of her wooden shovel across the location of the roof, she hit something solid but smooth. She swept the snow aside with her gloved hand, revealing the oiled canvas. It was intact. She moved lower, clearing the snow from the surface of the canvas. It was dark, buried under the blanket of white, but unbroken. The taut surface had held. The steep 45-degree angle had done its work. Much of the snow had sloughed off to the bottom, relieving the pressure on the covering. But the real test was inside. Sarah cleared the trapdoor, prying it open against the ice that had sealed the edges. A puff of air escaped. Not the biting cold of the surface, but a scent of humidity and earth. She dropped into the hole, fumbling for the thermometer she had hung on the center post. The mercury hovered at 48 degrees. Outside it was 10 below zero. The physics held. The snow, which she had feared would crush them, had acted as an additional layer of insulation, sealing the heat of the earth inside. "Is it dead?" Thomas called from the bright opening above, his silhouette framed by the blinding white sky. "No," Sarah called back, her voice thick with relief. She looked at the planting beds. The straw mulch was damp, and the air felt heavy and nurturing. "It's warm, Thomas. It's warm." She spent the next hour clearing the rest of the canvas surface, allowing the brilliant winter sun to filter through into the interior. The effect was instantaneous. As the light hit the stone back wall, the temperature in the pit began to rise, climbing past 50, then 55. It was a greenhouse effect in the middle of a frozen hell. Sarah stood in the light, feeling the sun on her face through the canvas, while just inches away, on the other side of the taut covering, the world remained locked in ice. This was the validation of the labor, the realization that they had stolen a piece of summer and hidden it underground. By January, the routine of the sun pit, as the children had begun to call it, became the anchor of their days. The landscape outside was monotonous and deadly, a world of grays and whites, where cattle froze standing up and the wind never ceased. But inside the pit, time seemed to have moved forward. Sarah would descend the ladder each morning to check the ventilation. On particularly sunny days, the interior temperature could spike to nearly 70 degrees, necessitating the opening of a small vent they had built into the upper frame to prevent the plants from wilting in the heat. It was a surreal chore, managing excess heat while wearing a wool coat to cross the yard. The first green shoots broke the soil in the second week of January. It was Emily who found them. She had gone down to fetch a stored jar of water and came scrambling back up the ladder, her eyes wide. "Green things, Ma. Little curled leaves." Sarah hurried down. There, pushing through the layer of straw, were the dark green, crinkled leaves of potato plants. In the dead of winter, amidst a landscape of dormancy and death, life was aggressively pushing upward. The psychological impact on the family was profound. The green was a color they hadn't seen in months, a vibrant promise that the world would not always be cold. Thomas took charge of the hilling process, carefully mounding more soil and straw around the stems as they grew, encouraging more tubers to form along the buried stalks. "They grow faster here than in the summer field," Thomas noted, his hands covered in the warm dirt. "The light is different," Sarah explained, pointing to the low angle of the sun through the canvas. "And the wind can't steal the moisture." She watched her son work, seeing the confidence returning to his movements. He was no longer just a boy surviving a tragedy. He was a master of a system he helped build. They were not merely enduring the winter. They were outmaneuvering it. However, the isolation was beginning to wear on the community. Stories drifted in from the road. Families burning their furniture for heat, livestock dying in the drifts, the town mercantile rationing flour. The Miller homestead, with its strange canvas-roofed bunker, remained a subject of ridicule that had slowly turned into quiet speculation. Smoke rose steadily from their chimney, and the children looked healthy when seen in the yard. The skepticism of the fall was shifting into a suspicious curiosity. Sarah kept their progress quiet. She knew that desperate men could be dangerous, and a pit full of growing food was a treasure more valuable than gold in a famine. She inspected the lock on the trapdoor daily, reinforcing the hinges. The green shoots were now knee-high, a lush canopy of foliage thriving in the humid, subterranean air, unaware of the blizzard raging just feet above their leaves. The harvest came in late February, prompted not by the weather, but by the calendar of the plants themselves. The foliage in the pit had begun to yellow and die back, the signal that the energy had been transferred down into the tubers. Outside, the snow was still 2 feet deep, hard-packed and crusty, but inside, the cycle was complete. Sarah, Thomas, and Emily descended with baskets, the air in the pit thick with the smell of drying vines. Sarah plunged her hands into the first hill. The soil was loose and yielding. Her fingers brushed against firm, smooth skin. She pulled, and a cluster of potatoes, pale gold and heavy, tumbled out of the earth. They were not the shriveled, sprouting things found in root cellars at this time of year. These were new potatoes, crisp, thin-skinned, and filled with moisture. "Look at the size of them," Thomas breathed, holding one up to the light. It was the size of his fist. They dug for hours, filling basket after basket. The yield was staggering. The controlled environment, the constant moisture, and the lack of pests had produced a crop superior to anything they had ever grown on the surface. They had nearly 300 pounds of fresh potatoes. It was enough to feed them until summer, with plenty left over for seed. They sat on the earthen floor, surrounded by the bounty, eating raw slices of potato that crunched like apples, tasting the starch and the water, the literal flavor of their survival. It was during this celebration of harvest that the dog barked above, followed by the heavy thud of a horse's hooves on the frozen ground. Sarah climbed the ladder, pushing open the trapdoor. Mr. Henderson sat on his horse, looking gaunt. His coat hung loosely on his frame, and his eyes were hollow. He stared at the open trapdoor, and then at the basket of fresh, dirt-encrusted gold that Thomas held. The wind whipped around the neighbor's collar, but he didn't seem to notice. His gaze was fixed on the impossible sight of fresh produce in the dead of winter. The arrogance that had defined their encounter in the autumn was gone, replaced by a raw, hollowed-out hunger. The winter had been harder on the valley than anyone had predicted. The drifts had isolated the ranches, and the stores of salt pork and flour were running dangerously low for everyone. For Henderson, a man with a large family and a pride that usually prevented him from asking for help, stopping at the widow's house was an act of desperation. "Potatoes," Henderson said, the word coming out as a dry croak. He looked from the basket to Sarah, his eyes narrowing as if trying to detect a trick. "Where did you get fresh potatoes in February, Sarah? The mercantile has been empty since Christmas." Sarah climbed fully out of the pit, brushing the warm soil from her apron. She didn't smile, nor did she offer a word of, "I told you so." The vindication she felt was internal, a quiet settling of the anxiety that had plagued her for months. She signaled to Thomas, who struggled up the ladder with the heavy basket, placing it on the snow-packed ground between them. The contrast was stark, the vibrant, living tubers against the dead, white landscape. "We grew them," Sarah said simply. "Down there. The earth stays warm if you know how to ask it." Henderson slid from his horse, his movements stiff from the cold. He walked to the basket and picked up a potato. He rubbed the dirt off with his thumb, revealing the waxy, yellow skin. He pressed his fingernail into the flesh, and moisture beat it up. Actual water, drawn from the earth, not the dry dust of a root cellar. He looked at the canvas roof of the pit, then back at Sarah. The mechanics of it seemed to finally click in his mind, the south slope, the translucent covering, the depth. He had called it a grave, but he was holding life in his hand. "My cellar froze," he admitted, his voice low, looking at his boots. 2 weeks ago, the frost got in. We lost the seed stock. We're down to cornmeal mush." Sarah looked at Thomas and Emily. They were watching the exchange intently. This was a lesson she hadn't planned, but one that was necessary. Survival wasn't just about hoarding calories. It was about the stability of the community. A starving neighbor was a danger. A fed neighbor was an ally. Furthermore, the dignity of their labor demanded that the fruits of it be used to sustain life, not just their own. "Take the basket," Sarah said. Henderson looked up, startled. "I can't pay you. Not until the thaw. And even then." "I didn't ask for payment," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "Take the basket, Mr. Henderson. It's fresh food. It will keep your children healthy. But in the spring, when the ground softens, you're going to bring your team over and help us plow the lower 40. And you're going to listen when I tell you how to build your own pit." Henderson nodded slowly, a flush of shame and gratitude rising in his wind-burned cheeks. He hoisted the basket onto his saddle horn, the weight of it substantial. "I will," he said. "I surely will." He mounted his horse, looking once more at the strange, canvas-covered structure. "You were right, Sarah. I was looking at the sky, and you were looking at the dirt." He tipped his hat, a gesture of genuine respect this time, and rode off toward the road, the prize of the miller's labor secured to his saddle. The thaw came in April, turning the world to mud and revealing the wreckage of the winter. Fences were down, livestock carcasses dotted the fields, and many families were gaunt and weary. But the Miller homestead was different. They emerged from the winter not just intact, but strong. The sun pit had continued to produce until the days lengthened, providing them with a steady diet of vitamins and starch that kept the scurvy and lethargy at bay. When the snow finally receded from the south slope, the taut, oiled canvas roof of the Wallapini gleamed in the spring sun like a beacon. Word of the miracle potatoes had spread, carried by Henderson's admission and the visible health of the Miller children. The skepticism of the previous year evaporated, replaced by a humble curiosity. Men who had spent their lives farming according to the almanac came to stand at the edge of the pit, hats in hands, asking the widow to explain the angles, the depth, and the soil mixture. Sarah did not guard the secret. She understood that their survival was linked. If the valley thrived, they all thrived. She stood by the open trapdoor, Thomas and Emily at her side, explaining the principles of thermal mass and solar gain to men who had once dismissed her land as worthless rock. The validation was absolute. It wasn't found in speeches or apologies, but in the sound of pickaxes hitting the soil on neighboring farms. By May, 3 other families had begun excavating south-facing slopes, copying Sarah's design. The worthless, rocky incline of the Miller property was now recognized as the most valuable acre in the district, a natural machine for turning sunlight into food. Sarah stood on the porch of the cabin one evening in early June, watching the sunset. The air was warm now, filled with the scent of pine and wet grass. Below, in the pit, the second planting was already leafing out, protected from the unpredictable spring frosts that often killed surface crops. Thomas was down there now, checking the vents, a routine he performed with the casual expertise of a master gardener. Emily was sitting on the stone wall, reading a book in the fading light. They had done more than survive. They had adapted. The grief for James was still there, a quiet shadow that walked with them, but it was no longer a terrifying void. It had been filled with the work of living. Sarah looked at her hands, still rough and calloused, but steady. She realized that the fear of the frontier, the terror of the cold and the scarcity, had lost its teeth. They had looked into the freezing earth and found heat. They had looked at a hopeless situation and engineered a solution. She walked down the path to the pit, the gravel crunching softly under her boots. Thomas climbed out of the trapdoor, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Vents are closed for the night, Ma," he reported. "Ground temp is holding steady at 55. "Good," Sarah said, placing a hand on his shoulder. She looked at the structure, glowing faintly in the twilight, a warm, milky expanse of canvas against the darkening hill. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense. It was a scar on the land, a hodgepodge of mud and taut canvas. But to Sarah, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. It was the physical shape of their resilience. "We'll plant the pumpkins tomorrow," she said, looking out over the valley where the lights of other cabins were flickering on. "But we'll start the seedlings in the pit first. Give them a head start. Mr. Henderson said he's bringing over a side of beef next week." Emily piped up from the wall. "Said it's interest on the loan." Sarah smiled, a rare, full expression that softened the hard lines of her face. "That will be fine," she said. "We earned it." They stood together for a moment longer as the stars began to will overhead, a small, unbreakable unit on the edge of the wild. The cold would come again, inevitably. The snow would drift, and the wind would howl. But it didn't matter anymore. They knew what was beneath their feet. They knew that even in the deepest freeze, there was warmth waiting to be found, provided one had the courage to dig for it. The widow of the Bitterroot Valley turned back toward her warm cabin, leaving the warm, translucent eye of the garden open to the stars, watching over the life growing quietly in the dark.